so Baha'u'llah finally revealed that he was the promised one in this rose garden in Baghdad. And he announced his intention to unite humanity. And he was immediately then shipped off on this second exile from Baghdad to Istanbul, to the court of the Sultan. And in Istanbul, the same thing happened. More and more people started to hear about Baha'u'llah. His writings continued to spread. People would read his writings. They would come to find him and meet him, sometimes traveling long distances just to find who was the author of these words. And often, frequently, his enemies would come to challenge him, to challenge what he was teaching, and they would leave as devoted friends. And so the authorities said to themselves, this isn't working. And so they exiled him a third time, this time pushing him way out to a remote corner of the Ottoman Empire, where he would be far away from the major cities of the empire, and he wouldn't have access to so many people to spread his teachings. And out there, way out on the edge of the empire, way out really on the border of Europe, where really in some ways his footsteps straddled the east and the west at the same time. From this place of exile, Baha'u'llah began to openly announce his message to the entire world in the form of letters, which he wrote to many of the world leaders of the 19th century. He wrote this series of very powerful letters known as tablets to Queen Victoria in England, to Napoleon III in France. He wrote to the Kaiser of Germany, the Emperor of Austria, the Tsar of Russia. He wrote to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and the Shah of Iran. He wrote to the Pope in Rome. And he also wrote to the presidents of America. And in these letters, these tablets, Baha'u'llah urged these world leaders to reconcile their differences and to consult together, to talk together, and put their energy together into building universal peace. And he gave them a set of instructions, this kind of divine blueprint that they could use, if they chose to, by their own free will, to build universal peace. He told them to think of the world like a human body, where if any member of this body is diseased or afflicted in some way, then the whole body is going to suffer sooner or later. And he told these world leaders that if they did not recognize this interconnectedness of all the people of the world, if they did not recognize the oneness of humanity, they would face grave problems in the years and centuries ahead. In fact, there are very striking passages in these tablets where Baha'u'llah describes how he could see visions of rivers of blood flowing through Europe, and he could hear the lamentations of the city of Berlin in the decades to come if these rulers did not treat their people fairly. But he also told these world leaders that even if they all ignored him, it wouldn't matter, and that universal peace would be built by the people of the world, little by little. So, if not from the top down, okay, from the bottom up, we'll build it. And so Baha'u'llah sent off this call, this invitation to universal peace to the kings and rulers of the 19th century. And in a final attempt to completely remove him from civilization, two of the great superpowers of his day, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and the king of his own homeland, Iran, joined forces and exiled Baha'u'llah a fourth and final time, this time to the most inhospitable corner of the world that they could find, the old prison city of Akka in the Holy Land. And this this place, this prison city called Akka. This was a place that was really considered at the time as a backwater. It was considered to be a place at the edge of civilization. It was a place that, it was said that Napoleon, in his attempts to conquer the world, stopped at the walls of Akka. Because this was a place that was so foul and so disease-ridden that there was a proverb in the region that people used to say that if a bird flies over Akka, it drops dead out of the sky. And so Baha'u'llah was sentenced to life imprisonment in this prison city. But in spite of this imprisonment, he continued from his prison, through his writings, he continued to drive forward this movement that he had initiated, this impulse that he had put into the world for unity and universal peace and elimination of prejudice. He continued to drive this forward for the rest of his life. And after 40 years of exile and imprisonment, and having never seen his homeland ever again, but having delivered his message to the world, in spite of the really colossal opposition that he faced from the superpowers of his time, he very quietly passed away in the Holy Land, just at the very end of the 19th century, still officially a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire. But strangely, what all of these superpowers didn't realize at the time was that the long journey that they had sent Baha'u'llah on, over a period of 40 years, sending him from one city to another city, from one prison to another prison, all the way from his ancient homeland of Persia to the Holy Land, where you'll remember all of those Christians and Jews were living and waiting. This long journey had actually all been foretold and written down, step by step and place by place, thousands of years before, by the ancient Jewish prophets, when they wrote in the Bible about a distant future when humanity will finally learn how to live in peace. So obviously we still have a long way to go in that direction, but on that note of building peace, I wanted to sing a song that I actually wrote for the Bahá'í community in Iran. So even though Baha'u'llah's teachings have spread out to every corner of the earth over the past 100 years or so, the community of Baha'is in his homeland sadly still face persecution, ongoing persecution to this day, which has never ceased since it began in 1844. So this is a song. There are many efforts being made nowadays to raise awareness about the situation in Iran. At one point, Amnesty International actually described the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran as being one of the most serious human rights violations going on in the world today. And so this song is a small contribution to that effort to raise awareness about the situation of the Baha'is in Iran. Jasmine is going to join me on this one, and this is called 100,000 Veils. Come down and walk these roads around the city of Tehran, where 7 candles burn. Follow me, oh charity down to the crimson sea. 100,000 veils have covered the sun, and darkest clouds have blocked and blackened the blue sky. Did you hear the fate of those who educate, who even in the grave find no respite from hate? Have you seen the youth who gave their lives for truth? That girl who kissed the noose and welcomed all abuse. 100,000 suns have fallen to earth, with blasts that block the ears from hearing the new song. 100,000 veils have covered the truth. How many mothers' cries are lost in the tumult? There is no war to fight. You have no sacred right, no holy book to cite to make these wrongs seem right. Does it so offend to want this world to mend, to walk in hope to the end, and see each man a friend? Come down and walk these roads around the cities of Iran, which boast so much to man. So, moving forward in the story, I wanted to play another piece for solo piano, which is called The Laughing Master. So I wanted to just share with you a little bit about the inspiration behind this piece and the meaning of this title. So, just on the subject of this great challenge of building a more peaceful, united world, which I think is perhaps the great challenge of the world that we live in. And maybe I think that sometimes perhaps the reason that it's such a great challenge is because from some respects the world does seem to be becoming smaller and smaller all the time and more interconnected. But at the very same time, from other respects, the world seems to be becoming in some ways more and more sharply divided down so many different lines and barriers. And as time goes by, and as these divisions seem to be getting more and more tense and sharp, I think that many people in the world are really recognizing this what I would describe as a very urgent need to find ways of exchanging ideas in a context of unity and in ways of seeking to understand people of different perspectives and walks of life in the world. If the true purpose of religion is in fact to unite people in this very deep spiritual way, then I would say that perhaps one of the great tragedies in the history of world religion is the fact that not only have the great world religions often been divided against each other, but what is perhaps even more tragic is the fact that often religions have become divided within themselves, always, I would say, contrary to the wishes of their founders. And just from a personal perspective, I grew up in Ireland, and this particular kind of division was always like a noise going on in the background of my childhood in Ireland, because I'm sure some of you are probably aware, we had a long history of conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. And this conflict became so severe and so pervasive that it became known simply by one word: the Troubles. And even people outside of Ireland knew exactly what you were talking about if you spoke about the Troubles. So severe was this conflict. Now thankfully, due to a lot of effort and international assistance, in fact a lot of assistance actually from American presidents through the 80s and 90s, all of that violence and terrorism that went on in Ireland has now all been channeled into dialogue, and Ireland is now a very peaceful and lovely place. So please do come. But this conflict really went on in different forms for hundreds of years between these two communities of people who essentially share the same faith. They are all Christian, and yet because they have certain disagreements about their faith which they have no way of resolving, they have had their conflicts. And I think that we see this kind of division happening in many different parts of the world and within many different religions. And so in order to prevent this kind of division from ever happening again, Baha'u'llah did something which is really quite unique among the founders of the world's religions. That is, he wrote a will in his own hand. And in this will, he named somebody to come after him, somebody to guide his followers and help them to stay united. And this person, this successor, was his son, whose name was Abdul Baha. And Abdul Baha had really been Baha'u'llah's closest friend. He had actually shared with his father the 40 years of exile and imprisonment ever since he was a little boy. When he was about 8 years old, his father was arrested, he lost everything, and he went into exile with Baha'u'llah, and he was with him more or less the whole time, and he really knew Baha'u'llah better than anybody else. And so it was as if Baha'u'llah was saying to this community of people that he had drawn together, made up of people coming from many different religious backgrounds, different philosophical perspectives, that he had drawn together and was teaching how to live in harmony, like those different musical notes. It was as if he was saying to all these people, after I'm gone, if you have disagreements about my teachings, if you have clashes, you don't fight. You turn to my son, Abdul Baha, and he will guide you. He will keep you united. And really, if the purpose of the Baha'i community is to build unity in the world, it can't really do that unless it's united in itself first. And so Abdul Baha was really like this gift from Baha'u'llah to help the Baha'i community to remain united, working together as one, even on an expanding, increasingly complex global scale. But even though Abdul Baha was not the same as his father, he was not another manifestation of God, he still holds a very important place in the story of the Baha'i Faith, and he's often referred to as the master. In fact, even Baha'u'llah himself referred to his own son as the master, because Abdul Baha's whole life was this really truly masterful example of how to take all of these writings of Baha'u'llah, this ocean of writings about love and unity and progress, and translate those words into action, into the practical, unpredictable reality of our day-to-day lives. That Abdul Baha was once described as a man who walked the spiritual path with practical feet, because there were many examples in the life of Abdul Baha. What did love look like in practice? What does unity look like in practice? What does patience or justice or forgiveness look like in practice in the life of a human being? In fact, of all of the books that Baha'u'llah wrote, his son was like this living book, like his greatest masterpiece, a living expression of all of his teachings put into practice. And so for this reason, he's often known as the master, almost like a master craftsman, but of life itself. But interestingly, Abdul Baha never actually used this title. He never referred to himself in this way, and he preferred to be known by this name which he had actually chosen for himself at a certain point in his life, Abdul Baha, which almost on the contrary means servant of the glory of God. Just as Baha'u'llah means glory of God, Abdul Baha means servant of the glory, or servant of the light, whatever translation you prefer. And this name, Abdul Baha, really represented the ultimate practical example that he wanted to leave behind. And that was the example of service, of living a life that is in some way of service to one's fellow human beings, a life where serving each other, helping each other, listening to each other, this really becomes the ultimate expression of love in practice. In fact, there's a saying of Abdul Baha. He said that if you desire to love God, love your fellow man, for in him you will find the image and likeness of God. And if you desire to serve God, serve humanity. And so in this piece, I've tried to paint a kind of a musical portrait of Baha'u'llah's son. On the one hand, as the master, this great kind of exemplary dignity and nobility, and at the same time as Abdul Baha, this also exemplary lightness and joyfulness and humility, and a very simple desire to live a life that would be of service to humanity. So even though he spent most of his life in prison, Abdul Baha was well known for his great sense of humor. And so I've called this piece The Laughing Master, because everybody called Abdul Baha the master, but his own greatest longing was to be simply a servant.